prior to catching Scarface in 1987 in the end of February, we actually had worked the summer of 1986 catching most of the rest of the ferrets that were left on the Meeteetse complex here. And for the most part, those were consisting of two females, their litters, and one other male besides Scarface. So just before that time, in 1985, the winter of 1985 and 1986, we were down to 4 known ferrets in this whole area. Plague had decimated the colonies and distemper was in them, so a couple diseases pretty much caused the failure of the ferret population in the Meeteetse area, and we were catching some of the last animals that summer of 1986. But the winter before, we were down to 4 animals, those 2 females, Scarface, and one other male that we knew of out here. Fortunately, we believe Scarface went down from this colony here down to the pump station area and Rawhide Creek to breed those 2 females, and they both produced litters, and we were able to catch all of the litters that those females had, perhaps save one. I think we actually lost one to a predator, great horned owl, before we were able to catch it. But we caught the young of those 2 females, which were later named Jenny and Mom by the folks at the captive breeding center at Seville. And so those all were caught in the summer, late summer of 1986, and from that point on, we were really focusing our attention on trying to find Scarface and catch him. And at the time we were, of course, catching those last ferrets, we were very unsure of how things were going to work out, because that spring before we took Scarface down to Seville, there had been no successful breeding of ferrets, and the year before that there hadn't been any ferrets produced from the ones that we had taken down previously. So it was pretty nerve-wracking to actually have to catch the last ferrets and not know what the outcome was going to be. And that gets back to the mom story, where I felt especially depressed on one night catching her, so I wrote that experience up trying to catch her, and how distressing it was to go out and try to capture these last animals. By that time we'd had one breeding season already under our belts and no production, and we had a failed breeding attempt at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center with South Dakota ferrets. So things were not looking really bright for captive breeding, and yet that was the only option left for these ferrets. So we didn't make the decision. Some people way above our levels made the decision to catch them all, and it was our job to come out and try to do that. But it being field biologists who were not familiar with captive breeding programs, and we're thinking about the lack of success, it was especially distressful thinking about bringing these animals in and not knowing whether we would be able to actually produce animals in captivity or not. I don't know. Yeah, at the time, I think by the time we got around to actually trying to catch Scarface, I think the shock of rounding up the ferrets was kind of a bygone thing. We had already passed that stage of thinking, and we were just concentrating, well, we've already done that. We have one ferret left. We might as well put our best effort into catching that one and try to complete the effort, whatever the outcome. So that was the thought here. And I don't think, from my own perspective, emotionally, I don't think catching Scarface was as traumatic as catching Mom, just because at that point I was really wondering whether we were causing extinction or trying to help them by preventing extinction. So it was unclear to me at that point. Okay, so here we are, very close to where Scarface once lived, in at least up until about 1987 when we caught him, and it's just on the bench across the creek. This creek drainage is right near where he lived, and up and over the hill, can't see it from here, was a very small prairie dog town where Scarface lived most of the year. He moved from there down to the Rawhide Creek area and pump station area, probably to breed female ferrets that were down there, but he lived by himself up here in a really small town much of the time. And we had a lot of trouble finding him. We knew he lived on this town. We could very seldom get a decent look at him. In fact, we never got a really good look at him. We got glimpses of green eye shine each time we visited the town, but never really got a good look at Scarface, and certainly could not find a good place to catch him in the normal manner where you would find a ferret above ground and then spotlight it and actually set traps in the burrow where it descended. So we weren't able to do that with Scarface, so we wound up waiting from the summer of 1986 up to spring of 1987. We finally got a snowstorm in February, and we decided to actually just track him down in snow and set traps by just following the snow tracks to a burrow, and that's how we finally caught him. It was after we did find where his tracks went down on Rawhide Creek, not here, but he had moved down there, being that it was breeding season. Again, he was probably looking for the same females, and so he descended into that area, and that's where we found him with snow tracks. We set a trap on his burrow, set a few other traps, but we waited about a week before we finally caught him. It was a very unconventional technique for catching a black-footed ferret, but he was an unconventional ferret, so we had a problem with that, and we we deviated from our normal protocol. We didn't like to have traps set on a ferret for more than 24 hours actually, and we figured at this point we had tried so hard for so long that we would just stay with it until we caught him. And we did finally catch him after a 7-day, 24-hour day trap monitoring kind of protocol, new system for catching a ferret. But we caught him and sent him down to Seville, and he actually bred one of the ferrets there within just a few days of actually having brought him down. It was very quickly, and he was obviously out here in breeding condition and looking for some females and couldn't find them here, so he found them down there. He did so much of the early breeding that his genetics were way overrepresented in the population, so it took years of careful planning by the SSP program to actually bring the genetics back into balance and try to get more equal representation among the animals that we had here. And even then, we don't know what that representation means. It's probably a token gesture of representation compared to the genetics of black-footed ferrets on the bigger picture over their entire range. So these Meeteetse ferrets were always probably fairly closely related to one another, and then became even more so when we caught entire litters in 1986. So we had 5, 6, 7, 8, about 9 or 10 animals that we knew were all from the same family, basically, same two families of ferrets, and they themselves were probably related to one another fairly closely. So it was, it's worked out all right. We haven't seen major problems from inbreeding depression and that sort of thing, but down the road we're not quite sure about that either. And they're doing well on where we've put them out and where we have good habitat. They're doing well, which bodes well, I think, and maybe tends to lighten the thoughts about potential inbreeding depression and genetic problems that might have occurred, but we're not seeing it. So I think that part of it is still an open question, but in my mind it's partly answered by having such successful reintroduced populations elsewhere. They've boomed actually in some places, so that kind of argues against the idea that genetics is going to be a major issue. But well, we're hoping to buy them some time, to give all of us time to come to our senses and try to do a better job taking care of this planet. But anyway, I've probably said too much already.
No.